Good evening, everyone.
Good evening. Good evening.
It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm grateful to Reverend Hagler and his church for inviting us, for hosting us here. And before I start with my remarks, I wanted to mention something that I had seen on Twitter a few minutes ago. Apparently, the Ecuadorian government is indicating they're going to expel Julian Assange from the embassy in London, which, of course, is connected with all of the work that we do. This abuse of state power, this determination to silence a whistleblower is something we must all keep in mind. If you look at our website, the Black Alliance for Peace website, you'll see our mission statement. It says, quote, "The Black Alliance for Peace seeks to recapture and redevelop the historic anti-war, anti-imperialist, and pro-peace positions of the radical black movements," unquote. And yes, it was quite intentional that BAP was founded on this date, April 4th, the anniversary of Dr. Martin Luther King's speech in which he renounced the Vietnam War, and the anniversary of his assassination. And I have to say, I'm glad that I'm old enough that even though I was a young child, I remember Dr. King as a living being. And not as this once per year nice man who gave one nice speech in Washington and then mysteriously got shot and nobody ever says why that happened. But even though I was a kid, I have a memory of that time when millions of people spoke openly about revolution, when people in our community admired the Viet Cong, and the Black Panthers had a thriving membership. And that's this legacy that we seek to recapture. But our polity has been twisted and perverted after the liberation movement was destroyed by COINTELPRO, assassinations and political imprisonments. And now, 50 years later, the party that black people cling to is as much a party of corporate interests and militarism as the Republican Party. And in supporting them, we have ended up signing on to mass incarceration, endless war, and austerity. The targeting of black politics by corporate interests accelerated the political loss, but there was worse to come. A black man was elected president, and our historic affiliation with left politics was cast aside in favor of representation, the siren song of the black face in the high place. And Glenn already touched on this. I don't want to spend too much time talking about it, but I will mention one thing. Before he was elected, black people identified with international struggle. We didn't believe what we were told about wars and interventions. And when we were told that foreign leaders were, particular leaders were enemies or adversaries, we assumed that those targets were worthy of our admiration. If no one in the United States supported Fidel Castro, black people did. Right. There was no question among black people that the Vietnam War was wrong and the struggle of those people was just. When Ronald Reagan attempted to kill Muammar Gaddafi, it was black people who condemned the act. But Gaddafi was eventually killed by an American president, and it wasn't by a Republican. The killing came at the hands of a Democrat, the black one, initials B and O. And the only thing more shameful than the US and NATO attack on Libya was the eerie silence from our community about this war of aggression. The voices of condemnation were too few. Most of us had chosen to defend that face in a high place instead of the people whose country was destroyed. And that whole sorry episode tells us why we need the Black Alliance for Peace. That's right. Why we need a black-led, people-centered movement, one that won't shrink from doing what King did on this day in 1967, when he publicly expressed his opposition to the Vietnam War. And he was not praised. Not at all. He was condemned by the media and by short-sighted and opportunistic people in his inner circle. The New York Times and the Washington Post and others of that ilk were blunt. They said he didn't have a right to speak about international issues. He should have stayed in his lane and talked about civil rights. But King knew he had to talk about all of it.
That's right.
About the public money spent on war instead of human needs, and about the wrongdoing committed by this government when it acted as the greatest purveyor of violence in the world. At BAP now, we attempt to follow in those footsteps. We march against war and US and NATO foreign military bases. We also protest police murder and all violence carried out by the state, whether within our borders or in Syria or Somalia. Like King, we declare a right, an obligation to speak to all of these issues. And to our friends in the peace movement, we make clear that there is a necessity for a Black-led movement in those ranks, because not all of us were bamboozled by Obama and others. We have a unique stance because of our history, and we bring that with us in all that we do. Our movement could be stronger. Our numbers are not what any of us want, but we can change this by speaking to the issues that impact our people. The perspective of people who face racism in all of its forms is desperately needed, and our friends should welcome this leadership. A couple of days ago, I had an interesting experience on social media, which I'm addicted to, I admit. Oh, my. And I was on Twitter, and I responded to this actress, Maria Conchita Alonso, who's Venezuelan, and who's an anti-Maduro person. And she tweeted, "Imagine hospitals with no electricity or water, food and medicine rotting. We need military intervention now." That's an actual hashtag on the part of those forces, hashtag military intervention now. And I usually don't. When I see things that I think are crazy, I usually let them pass, but I chose to answer. And I said, Venezuela needs an end to sanctions, and Guaido must stop the sabotage of the electrical system. Do you want war? Do you want people to die? And I got a response from one of her supporters, and he said, I'll cut it short, I'll cut to the chase. He said, quote, "Ignorance like you better keep shining shoes," unquote. Now, nobody said anything about shining shoes, but I'm gonna go out on a limb and say that that is a response that a white person or any non-Black person would never get. And I raise this issue, I relate this story, because that is part of my lived experience. And that remark was obviously clearly racist. And so I didn't need to read about a racial divide in Venezuela, about support or opposition to the government. My eyes and my common sense tell me where those people stand and where I should stand. So this is a moment which proves the need for the Black Alliance for Peace. And you can see that our sign says no compromise, no retreat. Defeat the war against Africans, Black people in the US and abroad. And this war is waged against us all over the world by the 1033 program, which sends surplus military equipment to police departments all over the country. So little one-horse towns have armored vehicles. And it may look silly and ridiculous, but this is deadly serious on the part of our government. Including members of the Congressional Black Caucus, most of whom voted to approve this program. And there's a very direct connection between people wearing military uniforms or people wearing police uniform, whose job is to keep us under physical control or to kill if they should choose to. And it's also important to think about why we're needed as we begin this spectacle of a presidential election, which is less than about a year away. And we're always told to forget about foreign policy and support a candidate who's on the right side of domestic issues, because that's the best we're going to get. And we should make do with Democrats who make mealy-mouthed statements about opposing military intervention in Venezuela. And you notice how they say it. I'm against military intervention in Venezuela. They're not against sanctions. They're not against anything else that could overthrow that government. And they may even repeat the talking points of Trump and Pompeo and Bolton. Maduro's a murderous dictator, he's a brutal dictator, he's really evil, but I don't want military intervention. And, but we have to ignore that. And we have to do that every 4 years. We have to do it all the time. Because 51 years ago, Dr. King was told the same thing. He should be happy with Lyndon Johnson's largesse. and he should keep his opinions about foreign policy to himself. So if we claim to revere him on this anniversary, every April 4th, as so many people say that they do, we certainly can do no less. We can certainly do no less than to speak up and to say that we are going to talk about peace, we're going to talk about war, and we're going to make the connections between justice here and justice abroad. Thank you very much. Yes.